It's Wednesday morning, geeks and geekettes. Time again for Ask Chuck Dixon, where you ask me questions and I answer them about what I do for a living, and what I do for a living is I write comic books. As I promised you last week, we are going to continue with this excellent series of remarks and questions from Green Adrenaline 6405. I said that this is a topic that I've nibbled around the edges, that I've never really fully explored on this broadcast of mine, and it's deserving of its own episode. This topic is far-ranging, and you deserve some background, you deserve some history. For those of you who couldn't join us last week, Green Adrenaline 6405 said, I got into comics because they are historical and an important part of our American identity. For as long as I can remember, Superman has always been my number one favorite superhero, and it's because of his attributes that I also found much fondness in Captain America many years later. I hold much affinity for these two blue Boy Scouts because of their inspirational natures and fighting spirits. Ironically, my two favorite characters were the trailblazers for their respective companies. Supes and Cap have become the ultimate political tools to further the Big Two's own agendas, especially after Superman rescinded his American citizenship and Cap very recently coming out this year and no longer believing in the American dream, in an issue that was released around the time of July 4th. Personally, I think the industry died when those in charge at the Big Two turned their backs on the real Big Two and put them in the history books. Is it safe to say that these two wholesome characters will never again regain their integrity because of antagonistic Marvel and antagonistic DC have already been gung-ho with anti-American messages in recent years? Pretty sure I already know the answer, but I wanted to hear your input. Well, buckle up. Okay, let's start with Superman. Definitely one of the great iconic superheroes of our time. He is probably the first thing that comes to mind when anybody thinks of a superhero. Enormously popular. Sprung on the populace by surprise. Way back in the 30s. And much to the surprise of DC Comics, or as it was considered then, national periodical publications, Superman was an enormous sellout hit, which they were not aware of until they realized that absolutely no issues of Action Number 1 had been returned from the newsstands, which meant it was a comic book with 100% sell-through. So they leaned into Superman, built a company around Superman, and cashed in on Superman in every way, shape, and form. And he's right at the center of not just American pop culture, but world pop culture. He's been radio shows, toys, TV shows, movies. He continues to this day almost an uninterrupted stream of Superman content in cartoon form, live action, and all the rest of it. And, he's a great character. He's a great character. But they can't seem to just leave him alone and let him be. Let him be the character that he's supposed to be, which is, he is an icon. He has no character arc. Superman and Clark Kent's character arc ends when he meets Lois Lane. That's the only really big change in his life. Yes, there's Kryptonite, and there's Lex Luthor, and there's the Bottle City of Kandor, and whatever else you want to throw in to the Superman mythos. But for all intents and purposes, his arc begins when he lands on Earth. Because he's a baby. He doesn't remember Krypton. He lands on Earth, raised by the Kents, and goes to Metropolis and meets Lois Lane. And from there on, his character is set in stone. Now, does that mean he's a dull character? No. He's a nuanced character. He's an alien who desires to belong to the human race. Not only that, but he identifies as an American. Forget that crap about him abandoning the American way. Why would he abandon the American way? What other way would he adopt? The Chinese communist way? I don't think so. He's and this is what eludes most writers. They either don't have the craft, don't have the talent, don't have the imagination, don't have the ability to work with a character that's this iconic, that's this unmutable. The challenge with Superman, there's many challenges with Superman. You know, he's a godlike figure. So you have to come up with challenges for him. You know, you have to come up with challenges to his abilities. But what you don't want to do is constantly be shocking his moral sensibilities, which seems to be the way they go. They're gonna, you know, he's like some steadfast, stuck in the mud kind of character who's a bit of a naif, and needs to be, needs to have his beliefs challenged or his moral stance challenged all the time, as if he's never seen anything. He's seen everything. He's seen everything from space. I mean, we can imagine in a real universe where a real Superman existed, he is looking at the worst humanity has to offer as well as its best. He's an outsider. He's an observer. He's seen everything. You're not going to present something to Superman that's going to make him change who he is. It's going to make him abandon the values that the Kents instilled in him. He embraced those values. He lives by those values. And you know the proof that he lives by those values? He never tries to rule the world. Because of all the characters in comics who could rule the world, Superman is the guy. He could run this planet. And he could be well-meaning. Think about it. You're Superman. People are always calling for help. And you got super hearing. You can't ignore them. They're calling for help. This one needs help. That one needs help. There's a bridge collapsing. There's an earthquake. There's a tornado. You know, Timmy's falling down the well. And who's going to save him? Superman. And in a lot of cases, Superman's the only one that can save him. Now, if you were Superman, wouldn't you try to put a stop to all this shenanigans? Humans always getting into trouble just so you can get a good night's sleep? I mean, if I were Superman, I'd have everybody wearing safety helmets. If they had to drive in a car, it would be like a death-proof car. It would be a bumper car. I wouldn't let anybody drive over 30 miles an hour. I mean, if you were Superman and had the powers of Superman, and you didn't have Superman's principles, you would be an authoritarian, and you'd be in the position to make those rules stick. To me, that's the proof of who Superman is. But he's a tremendously nuanced character, and he's a fascinating character. And he doesn't need to be changed in order to make him interesting. He already is interesting. The other thing about Superman is he's a badass. Superman is he's a Boy Scout, but he's also a badass. And what they need to do more often is stop making the stories about Superman. And you're sick of hearing me say this, but write a good story and put Superman in it. You can mock the Mort Weisinger era of Superman as sort of naive and silly, but they understood the challenge of creating interesting Superman stories. So they got a little weird and wacky when they were doing it. But the one thing all those stories have in common is that you have to finish them. Once you start a Weisinger era Superman story, written by Edmund Hamilton or somebody like that, you've got to finish it. You got to find out, why Lois grew a tail or whatever ridiculous thing started that story off. And that's the beauty of it, because at least they understood how the character works. Now, let's go back to the origins. I'm going to get to Captain America, but I want to go back to the origins of these creators. Now, Superman was initially created by two teenagers who were not professionals. And they just sort of wanted to be in comics, and they had this idea for this Superman. And they brought him to DC, and, were ultimately taken advantage of because they were teenagers. DC saw them coming. They just sort of had a handshake agreement, a verbal agreement, and as I believe it was, Harry Cohn, the film producer, said, a verbal agreement is not worth the paper it's printed on. And it certainly wasn't for these guys. They got a little bit of payback in their 70s when this picture was taken. Obviously, they were much older men. They got a little bit of payback, but nowhere near the amount of cash that DC had raked in. That should have, and nowhere near the pile of cash that DC should have willingly surrendered to them for creating, one of DC's greatest characters and one of the greatest characters in comic books, greatest characters in pop culture. That brings us to Simon and Kirby, creators of Captain America. What do Siegel and Schuster and Simon and Kirby have in common? And how did what they have in common lead to them creating the characters they created? Well, they were all young Jewish men. And they were young Jewish men at a time when it was not easy to be a Jew. Probably in the history of bad times to be a Jew, the 20s and 30s, when these guys were growing up, were the worst. They talk today about institutional racism and systemic racism. Yeah, forget it. This was, empirical racism. This was, national racism. And it wasn't just in Europe, where the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism were everywhere, all over Europe, from one end to the other, and in the United States as well. The Ku Klux Klan marched on Washington in this period. And it wasn't just a little tiny march with a couple of guys in their silly clown suits. There's a couple of 100,000 guys in hoods and burning crosses and their weird flags and having their weird handshakes. These guys weren't the Masons. They meant harm to different minorities, blacks, Catholics, and Jews, but a special hatred for Jews. So it's not a good time. Not a good time. But all of this feeds into the creation of Superman and Captain America, almost directly. Now, Simon, Kirby, Siegel, Schuster, they were first-generation Americans. Their parents came over from Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, wherever. I don't know where their families came from, but they came from somewhere in Europe. And they came here, their parents came here during a mass immigration in the early part of the 20th century. And all kinds of people came here. Germans, Irish, Italians, Poles, and Jews were among all of them. And they lived in the worst conditions imaginable. Just squalid, crammed in together into cheaply built apartment buildings, cheek by jowl, 15 people living in 2 rooms. They were all walk-ups. There's no elevators in these buildings, no air conditioning, no central heating. But it was better than where they had come from. You know why? Because no one was trying to kill them. There were no pogroms in the United States. There was no one looking to exterminate them here in the United States. Now, of course, there were prejudices. They faced bias. It was a restrictive society. It was an accepted norm to not allow Jews into certain businesses, to join certain organizations. They were barred, in a lot of cases, from participating in the American society. But that didn't stop them. The movie business owes everything to Jewish immigrants. Jewish immigrants went into the movie business, both owning theaters, making films, and distributing them. And the reason why this fell to Jewish filmmakers was because the early movies were lowbrow entertainment. Below lowbrow entertainment. They were considered trash by a lot of the populace, even though they were popular. It was just something that was not permanent. It was a fad. But Jews saw this as a way, into American society. They also saw it as a business that no one else wanted to get into. And so they built, they built the studios in New York City. They built the studios in California and began making a fortune at a nickel and a dime a ticket off of this business that everyone thought was crap. Okay. The film business was so looked down upon, now I'm being funny here, that most of the writers of the silent film era were women, because no respectable man would take the job unless his career was over or he used a pseudonym or whatever. But a remarkable number of silent films, including many, many of the classics, were written by women. In fact, there was a lot of work for women in the silent film business because, as I said, professional writers, professional artists, they didn't want to be a part of it. And actors, they had to create their own actors because professional actors would never act in a film. It would be the end of their theater career to stoop to act in a film. So that when they did get professional actors from the theatrical world, they were either, at the very ends of their careers, or they weren't very good, or they were drunks, or they were drug addicts. And because film was seen as beneath them. It was low class, low brow. But what the Jews did, the Jewish film producers and everything else, was they created this whole new world. We think of film as an art now, not just a gimmick. And we feel it's a high art, and it is. And it's certainly, for the most part, an American art form, although the entire world has contributed to the art of film. And what these Jewish producers, the advantage they had over anyone else in American society was they were a minority of a minority, and they were outsiders, just like Superman. They were observers of American society. And they wanted these films to be popular, and so they were going to show America itself in the best light possible. And this just doesn't come from cynical marketing. These men loved America, even when it didn't love them back, because they knew the opportunity. They had an opportunity to build something for their families, for their people, and through building that, and through making the fortunes they made, they would be safe, and they would be accepted. This is the reason why immigrants would go into businesses that no one else would go into, tailoring and laundry and things like that. And they would do the best work possible because they were proud of what they were doing. And these film producers, and more so than the men who backed them, the real money men who just wanted money out of these movies, these film producers cared about this as an art form, as an ongoing art form. And so they wanted as many people to see these movies as possible. So they created this world of this very idealized America, this America that reflected our better angels almost every time. And the only aberrations were gangster films. And even gangster films existed to prop up and show in stark relief the American dream, the American way of life, by showing what happens when you step away from it, when you break the rules. And so across the board, they're presenting this positive escape for the American public. And they're rewarded by masses of people going to the movie theater. In the 30s and 40s, people went to the movie theaters 4, 5, 6 times a week. Even if you didn't have a lot of money, you went once or twice. And they went in droves. And these films would make fortunes for these studios, which they would then plow back into more content. And they weren't made from any particular point of view other than that of the view of an outsider. The view that only an outsider could have of what made America tick. What did Americans like? And these guys had a feel for what their audiences liked. and they knew how to respond. They knew how to respond to things they liked and things they didn't. They would fine tune, and this is all without study groups or, focus groups or any of that. These guys just had a gut instinct because of their backgrounds, because they were basically strangers to this land. A lot of these film producers still spoke with accents because English was still a second language to them. And yet they had this keen understanding of what this very young nation was all about. And they knew they wanted to be part of it. They knew they wanted to be in the middle of it. And they didn't want to guide anything or change anything or run anything. They just wanted to entertain and make a whole lot of money doing it. Because that's what you do in America. You find what you love to do and you make a whole lot of money at it. Because it's not a job. It's a vocation. It's a calling. And that's what these guys had. Now, comics are no different. Most of the major comic book companies that grew up out of a need. And the need was to keep the printing presses running at the major pulp houses. When pulp magazine sales began to fall down, that meant printing presses were idle. Printing presses were idle. Nothing was being turned out. You couldn't make any money. Those presses had to run all the time. So they began to reprint comic strips in book form. And they sold like crazy. So they sold like crazy so much that they exceeded the supply. The demand was so huge for this material. So they began to create new stuff. The new stuff was, for the most part, inferior to the newspaper strips. Now, newspaper strips are not considered an art either, but they were accepted by the American public as the funnies. They were part of the newspaper, and millions of people read them. I mean, tens of millions of people would follow Little Abner, or Terry and the Pirates, or Little Orphan Annie, or Gasoline Alley, or whatever. And adults too. And they were seen as just part of life, like listening to the radio or going to the movies. Comics were seen as for kids, primarily for children. And so they were cheaply produced. Nobody was paid very much. And they were lowbrow entertainment. And again, most of the publishers of these were, they were mostly first-generation American or second-generation American Jews. And they got into the business because no one else would. No one else saw the potential here to make money a dime at a time. Now, this brings us to Captain America, who, like Superman, is an American icon. Specifically an American icon. And again, like Superman, he's a character who has no arc beyond entering World War II. Defeating the Germans. He's this 98-pound weakling who becomes a super soldier through American know-how and American science. And he's the answer to the threat of the Third Reich and Imperial Japan. And he embodies that. He embodies every American ideal: loyalty, courage, tolerance, compassion, toughness, resourcefulness, all the rest of it. And he has no arc. Now, when Marvel brought him back, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby worked some changes on him so that he was kind of suffering from PTSD from all his experiences in World War II, which makes him the same as Superman in that, often today people will write stories in which Captain America is challenged in some way morally, like why don't you self-examine yourself and your motives. You're from another age and you don't belong here and you need to basically get woke. Hey, this guy saw the concentration camps. This guy saw humanity at its absolute worst. I mean, maybe not in the pages of the comic books, but he was in World War II, so you got to imagine he experienced all of it. So what are you going to tell this guy about moral relativism? What are you going to tell this guy about equality? What are you going to tell this guy about human rights? Nothing. He's going to tell you. And that's the thing. They keep wanting to change these characters instead of writing good stories for them. Again, Captain America, like Superman, he's a badass. I loved reading about Captain America when I was a kid because he won out no matter what. And that's how I wanted to feel about America. That we would win out no matter what. And so, the idea that he's a badass and shouldn't be changed and shouldn't be altered is completely lost on these people. They keep trying to alter it, question it, put it into the zeitgeist of the moment, or the zeitgeist of the moment as they see it, as if the beliefs they have today are as immortal as Simon and Kirby's original creation, or can be as immortal as that original creation. And that can't happen, can it? Because Cap and Superman, they are our better angels. And they shouldn't be brought down, deconstructed, or altered in any way beyond what they were originally. Because they're paragons. They're symbols. They're living symbols. And this is, the creators up until today were always aware of this. You don't mess with Superman. You don't mess with Captain America. You leave them as you found them. If it's your job to come up with new Superman stories and new Captain America stories, then you do it. And the thing is that these characters, for example, Captain America, he went to war, and Superman didn't. DC's idea is that for their characters like Superman, Batman, and the Justice Society to go to war is kind of silly because they're not going to be showing up in the newspapers. They're not real. They wanted to keep these characters in a world of fantasy. And there was some lip service to what was going on in Europe and the war and the rest of it. Some patriotic propaganda covers and maybe a few stories about Nazi spies. But for the most part, Superman stays out of the war because, let's face it, he could have won it in an afternoon. He would have just gone and found Hitler and Tojo and beat the crap out of him, and that would have been the end of everything. So to keep this sort of fantasy idea going, they sort of remove Superman from the reality of the day. Captain America, on the other hand, he wades in, him and Bucky, they go to war, and they're fighting Nazis and Japanese and, whatever. Hitler's stooges, they're right in the middle of every major conflict, fighting. Consequently, when the war is over, now they seem kind of irrelevant. Now DC's idea to keep Superman and Batman out of the war doesn't seem so dumb, does it? So Cap, Human Torch, Submariner, they all pay for fighting. They all pay for their service by being canceled. And basically, except for a brief reappearance in the 50s, vanishing from the newsstands until the early 60s. But the idea of making Captain America go up against the Nazis is kind of irresistible, isn't it? So if you see what I'm talking about here, that these characters grow out of the life experience and desires and dreams of both of their teams of creators. And a lot of people today will say, well, Superman is a liberal, and Captain America is either antiquated or he would be on the side of the left. And that Superman was actually a leftist in his heyday. They're confusing liberalism and leftism with populism. Yeah, Superman would go after evil landlords. It didn't make him a leftist. It made him a populist. Because this is the Depression. People were frustrated with the banks. They were frustrated with the landlords. They were frustrated with their politicians and their leaders and all the rest of it. And Superman is there to see injustice righted. And from the viewpoint of Siegel and Schuster, two young guys growing up, probably of limited means in New York City, they saw these kind of injustices all the time. and thought, well, what if there was someone here who could do something about that? Same thing with Captain America. Simon and Kirby can see what's going on in Europe, and they know from their own families the history that they came from of abuse. I mean, actual abuse, genocide, pogroms in Europe. And so they're going to create this American ideal character who's going to stand against this rise in fascism, this rise in anti-Semitism. But for both of these guys, both of the sets of creators, I should say, these four men, again, like the movie moguls of the past, they're observers of American society. They're part of American society. They're also observers. They're outsiders. They're outsiders by fiat because they are quite literally restricted from being more of a part of American society than others. And every immigrant group goes through this, but the Jews go through it for longer because they're such a small minority. And they're of a different religion, many, many different reasons for this. But they're outsiders. And like the movie moguls, they realize, well, if these characters are going to be popular, they have to be iconic. They have to represent the best aspects of America. And they got to be, square-jawed, Nordic, white guys. Steve Rogers is even a blonde. Steve Rogers is poster boy Nazi when you get right down to it. But they knew that for these comics to be accepted, they had to be seen, these guys had to be seen as the perfect Americans. And the perfect American in their mind looks like Superman, looks like Clark Kent, looks like Steve Rogers. And so this is the genesis of these characters, created by outsiders to American society. Men who love this country, as I said, even when it didn't love them back. And they want to varying degrees of success. Siegel and Schuster were inextricably tied to Superman, eventually got screwed over by DC and lost their jobs, never got back to the level of, remuneration and popularity that they had with Superman, even though they tried to create different characters. Simon and Kirby, on the other hand, went on to become comicdom's first millionaires by creating a whole range of different genres, introducing different genres to comics with enormous success: horror, crime, western, romance, their biggest success. And they worked for everybody. When Simon and Kirby came back from their military service in World War II, they were given a royalty check by DC Comics because DC continued to publish characters they had created, done by other creators. And DC thought that by giving them this royalty check that they would stay with DC because they realized that Simon and Kirby were moneymakers, even when they weren't there, when other people were working on their creations. Realized these guys were kingmakers. They were comic book stars, although they really weren't going to let them know that. But they thought a little check on the side would keep them in-house. And what Simon and Kirby did was they took that check and rented their own studio and started freelancing for every single comic book publisher in existence. That's how they created all these different genres. So two different sets of creators from the same background have two different, they follow two different paths, two different levels of luck. One, Siegel and Schuster specialized, Simon and Kirby did not. So anyway, that's the background on these characters. This is where they come from. And this is why they should never change. Because what you got here is the great basis for characters that are indelible. They're an indelible part of American culture. And to try to change them, try to alter them to go along with the times is, it's a crime, is what it is. It shouldn't be done. And it shows a creative bankruptcy and no appreciation of what these characters are about. So that's my deep dive. Maybe I'll address these questions again later, but I wanted to basically if you didn't know the history of these characters, that's where we stand. They are every bit the creation of mid-20th century America, and they stand for values that go back to the founding fathers. They stand for values that are at the heart of the American personality. And I don't care where you come from. I don't care if you have an accent. I don't care if you got your citizenship last week. You understand that. And if you got your citizenship last week, you probably understand it better than a lot of people. That America's based on an idea. It's based on an ideal. It's moving forward toward a better society, evolving. May never get there. It's not utopia, but it's evolving toward a better society. And Cap and Superman played a part in that, and continue to play a part in that. In fact, why not? Let's go all the way. Superman ended the Ku Klux Klan for real. You might have heard this story, you may not. Superman radio show, we're looking around for some villains. It was a serial. It ran 15 minutes every day. Kids would tune in. And they wanted to keep people tuning in. They needed villains. So they thought, well, why not have them go up against the actual Ku Klux Klan? And so they did. And whoever wrote the show did a lot of research into the Klan. They don't, like I said, they're not the Masons. They weren't very good at keeping their secrets. And so he used all this Klan terminology. Klaverns and Grand Wizards and Grand Dragons and Kleagles and all of the silly nomenclature that the Klan would use to identify itself. And because of this, they exposed the public to aspects of the Klan that they weren't really aware of. And in so doing, not only exposed the Klan, but they ended up mocking it. To the point where a lot of Klan members were kind of now embarrassed at what they were doing. And a lot of Klan members didn't want to be a member of the Klan anymore because, the hood had literally been pulled off. And people could see them for what they were. Kind of a silly boys club, that got violent. That would get violent. A dangerous silly boys club, but emphasis on silly. And Klan membership cratered. Collapsed. And when their membership collapsed, their influence collapsed. And they never recovered. I think they estimate today that there's 5,000 Klan members in the United States. I kind of think that's an exaggeration. It's kind of like gym memberships. You may have gone to one meeting, but you never bought the robes, So, because has anyone listening to this ever seen any real Klan influence in their community? I live on the Gulf Coast of Florida, once a haven for the Klan. I don't see any evidence. None, zero, zip, nada evidence that the Klan still exists in any real form or has any kind of influence. Whereas at the time the radio show was appearing, the Klan held sway. They controlled entire counties, especially in the Deep South, ruling through terror or influence or whatever. And here comes Superman, a radio show exposes them. Now, why would you change a character like that? Why would you try to, quote unquote, evolve a character like that? A character with that kind of power over the American public's imagination. And he still has it through the movies, through the cartoons, through the TV shows. People want Superman. And they want Superman the way he was created. They want Superman. They want classic Superman. Same thing for Cap. I was stunned, literally stunned at the Marvel movies because I thought this is the bellwether for me on the Marvel movies is how they treat Cap and the way that they treated him with respect. They didn't treat him like some sort of out-of-time doofus who didn't know what was going on. They, showed him as intelligent. And the most importantly, they also showed that his values, which were 50, 60 years, quote-unquote, out of date at the time the Marvel movies were made, were still relevant. More than relevant. That the rest of the Avengers and the rest of the Marvel characters could learn from Cap about loyalty, about tolerance, about strength, about courage, about stick-to-itiveness, about tenaciousness, and, fair play. So that, as I said, literally stunned me when they treated Cap as they should have treated Cap, not trying to alter him or make him a butt of a joke, or make him seem like he was past his time. He is past his time. He doesn't live in his time anymore. But the values of Captain America, just as the values of Superman, are timeless, and they're at the heart of the American personality. They're at the heart of the American character. They are the model, as created by the creators, of the American character. And for them to turn their backs on the American way, for Captain America to no longer believe in the American dream, is the work of unimaginative morons. So, there you have it. Deep dive. Excellent question, my friend, whatever your real name is. And you are the star of this week's episode. If you have a question, a comment, suggestion, have you done some artwork? You want me to take a look at it? I'll do it. Why not? I like looking at stuff. I like meeting new people, or meeting new people. Contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. That's brunobookstore@gmail.com. It's the most direct way to reach me. So that's it for this week. A little history lesson. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And I will see all of you down the road.